It's that time of the year. Biscuits, carols, Christmas jumpers, some uglier than others, in bright colors with funny patterns made from questionable materials. But did you know that the original Christmas jumper was actually not meant to be ugly and that we actually owe them to the Scandinavians? Let's have a look in my Christmas special. Let's start at the beginnings, and this is the tradition of knitting in Europe. It is a bit tricky to determine how old knitting actually is or where it came from. Some assume that it came from the Mediterranean or the Middle East to Europe, but there's no proof of that. And it became very popular in the 20th century. Before that, knitting was predominantly used to produce smaller things such as socks or mittens. And while the ugly Christmas jumper today is very popular in the English-speaking countries, it actually all started in the Nordics. It is assumed that knitting started in Iceland and the Faroe Islands in the 16th century, and there are also knitted objects that were found in Norway from that time. It is also assumed that during this time it was also known in Denmark and in Sweden. In the 17th century, knitting was not organized in guilds like other techniques. It was spread in the Nordics predominantly among the poor because, for example, it was taught in jail. Later on, there were also the so-called Manufakturhus that produced knitted products, and they used poor people or prisoners or also slaves to produce those products. And there are records that women in Norway in the 18th century earned an income by selling knitted products or by teaching knitting techniques. And this was also the time when the knitting technique moved up the social ladder because it became something that was used by the poor and then was also noticed by the upper class. But it was not until the 19th century until the technique spread throughout the region, especially also in Norway. This was also the time when it was incorporated into the traditional costumes of some communities. And then also wool mills and knitting factories were established, and very often they got the raw materials from the farmers surrounding the mills or the factories, and then as payment they gave them back the finished knitted products. A big shift came during the interwar period in the 20th century because suddenly the activities of people changed. People spent more time outdoors, they also did sports, and they needed garments for that. For example, bathing costumes, leotards for sports, or also golf jackets, and a lot of them were knitted. And this was a big change because previously knitted garments were only worn by workers, for example by the fishermen, and suddenly men, women and children were wearing those garments. Another boost for these garments came with the polar expeditions, and it's also interesting that during the Second World War the two-colored yarn stood for Norway, so also this garment had a strong political message. And this political message of knitting was then enforced during the German occupation because then the red top hat was banned by the Germans, and also due to the shortages during wartime, knitting became popular because you could easily re-knit old garments into something new and basically recycle your old garments. And after the war, knitting became even more popular because then the quality of yarns increased and also magazines started to publish patterns, so it was quite easy to knit yourself, and this was actually a big trend after the war. Another source for today's ugly Christmas jumpers is Workwear, as I mentioned before. Benjamin Wilde, a fashion historian, says that fishermen in the Nordics wore those jumpers because then if they drowned they could be found more easily. Later on, also skiing spread this trend of the Nordic jumper because people came to Scandinavia and saw the locals ski in these garments, and then they took the trend back home. And also the pattern spread to many other regions. For example, in the UK there's the Fair Isle pattern, which you may know, and this is also based on these Nordic patterns. And I also have very fond childhood memories because we had a ski moderator in Austria called Robert Seger, and he used to wear these Nordic jumpers. He had a very big collection of them, so every time we watched a race it was a different jumper. So this is something funny that I still associate with the Nordic jumper. And I would like to mention two Norwegian brands here. This is a non-sponsored post, but it is essential to know about them to understand the development. It's Devold of Norway and Dale of Norway. Devold of Norway was very famous for their Islander sweater, and later on they were also supplying polar expeditions. And Dale of Norway was then also chosen by the Olympic Committee to supply the garments for the Olympics, and they are still supplying the garments for the Norwegian ski team. I have talked a lot about the Nordics now. Let's go back to our ugly Christmas jumper. So the first time where there was actually kind of a trend was in the 1950s in the movies, because there was something called the Jingle Bell sweater, and in some Christmas movies, this was also the time when movies commercialized Christmas, people wore those jumpers. They were not ugly, they were like these Nordic jumpers, and somehow this trend didn't really take off. It only picked up again in the 1980s because the commercialization of Christmas was then enforced again. We had movies like National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, where Clark Griswold wears these ugly jumpers, and then of course in the 1990s we have Home Alone, where everything is curated around Christmas and Kevin wears those beautiful jumpers. And also we had the Olympics in Lillehammer in 1994 in Norway, and again the Nordic jumper then increased in popularity, but then it decreased again. And then you also may remember at the turn of the new millennium, these Christmas jumpers were still nothing fashionable, and the movie that illustrates this probably best was Bridget Jones, because Colin Firth wears this ugly Christmas jumper and Bridget can only cringe when she sees him in that outfit, and this is exactly how people felt about it. It was something an old relative would wear, but nothing who is very fashionable. But there's something about the Christmas jumper, and maybe because it is ugly, but it gives us this warm feeling about Christmas. And in 2002 the first theme party was held in Vancouver, and soon after that actually there was a real trend in these ugly Christmas sweaters. So maybe this party and then also maybe Bridget Jones, they helped fuel this trend of ugly Christmas jumpers. And then of course fast fashion retailers jumped onto the ugly Christmas jumper bandwagon, but the Nordic jumper also inspired many designers. For example, Stella McCartney in 2007, then also Givenchy in 2010. Also there was a collection by Dolce & Gabbana, and also I spotted it twice in 2016 and 2019 at Chanel. So it is something that also gave big inspiration to luxury brands and designers. But what we can see is with this increase in popularity of this ugly Christmas jumper, the original Nordic jumper moves more and more into the background, and the crazy versions become more and more popular. If you do a quick search online, you can buy basically anything for your Christmas jumper. For example, Star Wars pattern, or also Santa who uses the chimney as his toilet, or this year of course also Barbie themed ugly Christmas sweaters. And another boost for ugly Christmas jumpers happened in 2012 with the UK based charity Save the Children. They asked people to donate their ugliest Christmas jumpers for the charity, and since then they have raised more than $44 million. Of course, also celebrities are fans of the ugly Christmas jumpers. We have Taylor Swift, Elijah Wood, Ryan Reynolds, Miley Cyrus. Jimmy Fallon came up with a special segment dedicated to the ugly Christmas sweater, which he still does every Christmas. And needless to say, they are also popular on social media. On Instagram, the hashtag ugly Christmas sweater has around 880,000 posts. And before I send you into the Christmas holidays, I would just like to say one more thing. This year, when you want to buy an ugly Christmas jumper, maybe think twice about it. Maybe buy a better quality Christmas jumper, or maybe don't buy a new one. Maybe go for a second-hand version if you really want this surprise effect of a new funny Christmas jumper. Maybe it is an idea to invest in a long-term solution like an original Nordic jumper. And I'm also interested in you. Do you actually wear ugly Christmas jumpers, or do you hate them? Or do you have these traditional Nordic jumpers? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Also head over to thepinklookbook.com for more fashion related articles, and don't forget to check out my store Pelagona. And now I'm going to wish you Merry Christmas and see you soon.